Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Let's kick it off with the news of the day, which of course is the auto tariffs that have been announced in the last 24 hours or so, all in anticipation of Liberation Day, as the Trump administration calls it, going into next week. Walk us through, from your experience with the Trump administration, what the end goal here is of these tariffs.
Well, I think he has a couple of end goals. One, of course, is to relocate manufacturing back to the United States. And our biggest trade problem is actually autos. It's hundreds of billions of dollars of problems. So one of his objectives is move manufacturing back. The second objective is to gain more revenue, because to the degree that the tariffs are paid, there will be more revenues coming in. And then the third is to hopefully have the potential inflationary effects of those items offset, one, by changes in currency. If you notice, the currencies have already been weakening against the dollar. So that will absorb part of it from the American consumer. I believe that the foreign manufacturers will also absorb part. My guess is that in many cases their governments will absorb some, and some will be passed on to the U.S. And in the U.S., since most companies are only operating at 70 to 80% of capacity, it can absorb some hit because the incremental production is relatively low cost as you move up from 70 or 80 toward 100.
Does that apply, Secretary Ross, when it comes to reciprocal tariffs as well? Does the math work in the same way?
Well, it all depends how he puts them in. My hope is that what he'll pick out is a limited number, maybe 3, 4, 5 of the very important ones, and put the same tariff for every country on those. If he goes a different route, for example, if he went the route of saying the average blended rate from this particular country is X, and we'll apply that blended rate to everything they do, then you'd have an anomaly in that it would mean more of a tariff on the lowest tariffed goods and less of a tariff than matching on the highest price. So it's very complicated to implement, and what I think it wouldn't work very well would be to say this country has a so-and-so percent tariff and this other country has a 5% higher tariff, and put in different tariffs on the same product. That would be very, very hard. It would probably lead to transshipment and thereby create a loophole that defeats the purpose of the tariff to begin with. So
Secretary Ross,
will depend on the mechanics.
Right. Secretary Ross, Donald Trump has talked about, and his colleagues, I should say, should have talked about very often when it comes to reciprocal tariffs, including things that one would not traditionally include. For example, things like regulation coming out of the European Union, taxes like the VAT, among other examples. Non-tariff barriers, I believe, is the phrasing he used. If the goal is to remove the barriers and to remove the regulation and make it easier for American companies to operate abroad, when those barriers are reached, do you think Donald Trump will respond in the same way, aka remove tariffs or remove barriers from the United States that he's placing right now?
Well, non-tariff trade barriers are in many cases even worse impediments to our trade than the tariff barriers. For example, the EU bars bans GMO-enhanced foods. That's worse than any tariff because it means we simply cannot ship it into them. Similarly, the VAT. If a Mercedes is bought in Germany, there's a VAT on it. And in most countries, it's around 25%. But those same countries rebate the VAT on export. So without tariffs on our side, a Mercedes would literally cost less in the U.S. than it does in Germany. Whereas in contrast, since we don't have a VAT or anything else that we can rebate on export, a car shipped from the U.S. pays the VAT. So an American car shipped to a VAT country costs more in that country than it does at home. So VAT is a component of the disparity.
Secretary Ross, let me bring it back to your first point about increasing manufacturing within the borders of the United States. Critics of that strategy would say the volatility surrounding the tariff announcements is enough to disincentivize any sort of credibility that a long-term investment in the United States is a good idea. If the economics of tariffs work, do you think the execution of them is a concern?
Well, the execution is a concern. And to my mind, the simpler and more broadly based he makes them, the better. Because the way you actually implement tariffs is each product needs to have a 6 or so digit code number associated with it. And it's that code number that's used for enforcement. So the more products, and there are tens of thousands of products that we import, the more products that you change things on or vary them by country, the more complicated the implementation becomes.
Well, Secretary Ross, I'd like to stick with that line of thinking and talk about maybe a little bit of what's driving some of the domestic policy within the United States as well. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump has been quite vocal about the idea that tariff revenue can help pave the way for an extension of his 2017 tax cuts or even further tax cuts for the American public. Does the math add up there? Does more tariff revenue from outside of the United States help the Trump administration issue tax cuts for the people within?
Well, surely it does. Whatever revenues come into the government can either be used to reduce the deficit or be passed on to the public. So money is fungible once it comes in. And I think part of what has people confused is President Trump does have multiple objectives for the tariffs. But in a sense, those multiple objectives mean it's a win-win in that to the degree that the goods still come in and tariff is paid, that will go into our treasury. To the degree that goods are no longer imported but made here, there'll be less come into the treasury from tariffs, but more coming in from the tax revenues paid by the manufacturing facilities set up here. So either way, there is an implication for federal revenues and therefore for potential tax cuts.
Well, Secretary Ross, the way Donald Trump is also potentially addressing the deficit and some of the costs around the U.S. government has also been, in addition to tariff revenue, talking about reducing the federal workforce. You've seen DOGE as one example of pretty swift actions in reducing that workforce. Is there anything you would do differently in terms of perhaps the end goals that DOGE has?
Well, they know they have to act very quickly. And the reason is this. Some of the measures probably will end up needing congressional approval. And by September of this year, all that the Congress will be focusing on will be the midterm elections. And that means they will be very unlikely after that period to do anything that's controversial. So part of the reason there's a great rush here is the political cycle relative to the congressional election. But there's also another reason, as I've learned from my working on distressed companies, and you can say the U.S. government is perhaps the largest distressed company in the world. The way that it's best to fix it is try to get as close as you can to one big bang so that people know, okay, they survived the last job cut. There's not going to be another one next week and the week after and the week after. Much better try to do it in one big bang. And that's why you're seeing him try to come very quickly with cuts. Now, going that fast undoubtedly means there will be mistakes, and some of those people will have to be rehired. But that's an unfortunate consequence, but it's inevitable when you're having to travel at the speed that they are.